as I said, it's actually very difficult to find any description of the psychoactive effects of antidepressants, but taking descriptions from people who've taken them, they seem to have two sorts of contrasting effects. The modern antidepressants, anyway, the SSRIs and various other more recently marketed antidepressants, they seem to induce a state of lethargy and listlessness and drowsiness, but at the same time seem to make some people at least rather agitated and panicky and tense and irritable. I should say actually that they're much milder psychoactive substances than many of the other drugs that are used and prescribed for mental health problems. So in many people they don't have many effects at all, and the effects that they have are more subtle usually. So the question is, I think, with the treatment of depression, well, can these sorts of effects be useful in someone who is depressed, clinically depressed or moderately or severely or whatever? And I think if we were talking to people honestly, we'd present antidepressants in a very different way from the way that they are currently presented. So the way they are currently presented by many doctors and by drug companies is this idea that they will help to normalize an underlying chemical imbalance, or at the very least there's a hint or an implication that they will normalize whatever's going on that's causing the depression. If we were taking a drug-centered approach, this is what I think we would say to people, okay? This drug affects the way people think and feel, but we don't really know how yet because we haven't studied it enough. It may dampen down emotions, suppress your libido, we know it does that, may make you feel a bit lethargic and drowsy, and some people it might make them feel a bit agitated. Do you think that would be helpful? That to me is what a drug-centered approach would involve in the case of someone with depression and the use of antidepressants. So, finally, I just want to spend a few minutes thinking about why it is that we've got to this stage where the disease-centered model has become so dominant and why we've forgotten all this information about what psychiatric medications really are, what sort of effects they induce, what they are like as drugs. And the first thing to consider is the professional interests that have been involved. The drug treatment, this new range of drug treatments that came in the 1950s, came at a lucky time for the psychiatric profession because it was shortly to come in for a barrage of attack and abuse from what came to be known as the anti-psychiatry movement, which was a very broad-based movement that came from many different intellectual quarters and also had a popular aspect to it. I mean, at its height, professors of biological psychiatry had to have armed protection in the Netherlands, for example, people who were investigating the use of ECT. One of the principal intellectual drivers behind the anti-psychiatry movement was Thomas Szasz, and he wrote this book, The Myth of Mental Illness, which was published in 1960, and then numerous other books afterwards, all of which challenge the legitimacy of the idea that mental disorders are medical illnesses. What he's saying through all his writing is that mental disorders are a different sort of thing from physical illness, fundamentally different sort of thing. And of course, this attack challenged the authority of the psychiatric profession, which is a branch of the medical profession, and called into question the basis of its principal approach to managing madness and distress. There was a lot of criticism from sociology and psychology. This was a famous experiment by Leon Rosenhan, where he sent his students into A&E departments, and they reported to the staff there that they'd been hearing a voice saying thud. And they were all admitted to psychiatric institutions, and they were all given a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And so Rosenhan concluded that psychiatrists could not distinguish between the sane and the insane. And I should also say that once they got into the institutions, they acted completely normally. but their normal behaviour was interpreted as being signs of madness. So one of them, who was making extensive notes about what was going on, was said to be showing compulsive writing activity. So psychiatry was on the defensive, and the response that it took was to reassert the medical nature of mental disorders. And the third version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is about to be published in its 5th version recently, soon, the third version moved away from the previous psychoanalytically based understanding and classification of mental disorders and started to classify them, started to compile lists of disorders with seemingly objective criteria for identifying them. So it presented mental health problems as if they were as easy and straightforward and non-subjective as if you were identifying a boil or a tumour. And the presumed disease-specific nature of the effects of psychiatric drugs was one of the main pieces of evidence that was mustered to support this approach to psychiatric classification. Because if diagnosis didn't direct treatment, then there really wasn't any point to it. So Robert Spitzer, who was the principal person, the head of the committee that came up with DSM-3, in his response to the Rosenhan experiment, actually emphasized that psychiatric diagnosis was legitimate and important because you could show that drugs and different sorts of treatments had effects in particular diagnostic groups, even though, if you read the book, and as I've tried to show very briefly, that evidence isn't really there. Drugs were also useful at this time because one of the main ways in which psychiatric practice differs from medical practice is in the use of force. Of course, a lot of psychiatric treatment is done without the consent of the patient under the Mental Health Act, or I'm not sure whether you call it the same thing here. I expect so. But in extreme conditions where someone becomes disturbed and violent and has to be held down and injected with something to sedate them, it's quite difficult to pretend that that's a therapeutic treatment activity. Antipsychotics, when they came in, it was soon realized that they were very useful treatments in this situation, that they could rapidly restrain someone and calm them down both physically and mentally, or slow them down both physically and mentally. But because there was already this idea that they were a specific treatment for schizophrenia, they could nevertheless they nevertheless helped these sorts of situations to be portrayed as a therapeutic activity rather than an activity of social control. And Thomas Saz, again, pointed this out. He was one of the first people to refer to these drugs as chemical straitjackets, and he talked about the dangers of seeing drug treatment in this way, that once you start to see what is actually essentially a situation of the forcible control and modification of someone else's behaviour, as soon as you start to see this as treatment, you forget the responsibilities and the guilt that you should feel in a situation like that. The other interest group that's obviously been influential in promoting this view of psychiatric drug treatment is the pharmaceutical industry, although interestingly in the 1950s and 60s up to the 1980s, really, the pharmaceutical industry will also could play both games. They could promote psychiatric drugs as disease-specific or as psychoactive substances, and they were quite happy to do both. But then there was, and they were involved in the early days of creating the modern idea of depression, along with the antidepressants in the 1960s. But then, in the 1980s, there was a crisis over the widespread use of benzodiazepines, and the idea of using mind-altering substances to shut people up, keep people quiet, stop people complaining, got a very bad reputation, rightly, of course. And so, as David Healy's very cleverly shown, they started to change the market for the benzodiazepines into a market for antidepressants. And they needed to get away from that bad reputation. They needed to portray the antidepressants as something that were reversing an underlying disease. So that disease-centered model became very important to them in the early 1990s. And then more recently, of course, we've seen the creation of other conditions, or the changing nature of other conditions like bipolar disorder, to sell new drugs. So this is what I was saying about antidepressants. So the idea that there was an underlying deficiency or disease was sold in a package with the drugs. They very much came together, the idea that you had a chemical imbalance and therefore you needed an antidepressant in the 1990s with the marketing of the SSRIs like Prozac. And Eli Lilly were one of the funders of a big campaign in the UK, and I know there have been campaigns here and campaigns in Australia that are similar, campaigns designed to increase the use of antidepressants by increasing the number of people who are diagnosed with depression. So this campaign suggested that 5% of the general population had depression, 10% of people attending general practitioners. It emphasised that antidepressants are not addictive, which has transpired as completely wrong and is now accepted as completely wrong. And it emphasised that they should be given for a few months and not just used for a brief period. It was very successful. We've already seen how much the prescribing of antidepressants has increased. More worrying, in a way, is the increase in prescribing of antipsychotic drugs, which has happened recently. And this has been achieved in various different ways, by expanding the boundaries of psychosis or schizophrenia, by this new concept of bipolar disorder, which has been heavily marketed, and also by a lot of unlicensed use of these drugs for people diagnosed with anxiety and depression, and in people with dementia, which you've probably heard about. So in a survey in 2007, it was found that 2/3 of people taking the new atypical antipsychotics did not have a diagnosis of psychosis or schizophrenia. Again, the marketing of these drugs has been strongly linked to this idea. I think this is a useful statement for understanding why this idea is so useful to the pharmaceutical industry. Antipsychotic medicines are believed to work by balancing the chemicals found naturally in the brain. That's my emphasis. So as you can see, instead of talking about how these are drugs that alter the way the body works, they're emphasizing all they're doing is just putting right what's there anyway. I don't know if there's anyone here from this program, but this is the early intervention program from Portland, from here in Maine, which is one of these programs that is trying to identify people at early stages of psychosis while they've still got very non-specific symptoms, such as spending more time alone, avoiding friends and family, dropping grades, having trouble focusing or paying attention, losing abilities in athletics or hobbies, okay? Things that many, many adolescents are going to experience. And this sort of program has led, as David Castle, an Australian psychiatrist, has shown, to very much a very large increase in the identification of psychosis or schizophrenia, probably accompanied by this increase in the use of antipsychotics. So the WHO estimate was 14 cases per 100,000. In an English early intervention service, they're identifying 50, and in the Australian service, which has been one of the forerunners in this area, he estimated they were identifying about 100 people per 100,000 population. The advertising and promotion has been very emotive, and a lot of it has been justified by this idea that psychotic symptoms are toxic to the brain. So they have to be stopped at the earliest point possible. You need to prescribe as early as possible. It turns out that it's probably the antipsychotics that are toxic to the brain, that all the evidence that people saw that the brains of people with schizophrenia and psychosis were getting slightly smaller over the first few months of their treatment, it looks as if that's attributable to their drug treatment rather than the disorder. So, in particular,